When al-Qaeda decided to move to Sudan in 1992-93, there was a logistical problem to be solved: what to do with the weapons. At the time, al-Qaeda owned several truckloads of weapons and military equipment that had been bought over the years to arm bin Laden's guerrillas. Some of the heavy weapons were probably borrowed or leased from the Afghans. They could be returned. But what about the rest? Suppose they could be sold in one of the sprawling weapon bazaars along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The problem was, these weapon markets were feeding the unholy business of Afghan civil war. Besides, the prices were terrible, and transporting the weapons from coast, where they were stored, down to Maram Shah would hardly be worth the effort. We do not know how the al-Qaeda leadership reasoned at the time, but there were some of the arguments used by Mustafa Hamid in meetings with al-Qaeda's leaders. Hamid had, of course, the perfect solution to al-Qaeda's logistical dilemma: donate the weapons to the Islamist opposition in Tajikistan. The Tajik Nahda Party, led by Muhammad al-Nuri, was preparing to launch a guerrilla campaign against the Tajik communist regime. Al-Nuri had already reached out to Islamist groups in Peshawar to get military support for their rebellion. Some of the Arabs in Peshawar thought Tajikistan could be their next Afghanistan, a continuation of the jihad against an ungodly communist regime. The Tajikistan Project was originally Mustafa Hamid's idea, or so he describes in his memoirs. The project had at least two goals. One was to train Tajik commanders in a form of train-the-trainers program in coast. The other goal was to supply the Tajik opposition with weapons. Hamid convinced al-Qaeda to donate their weapon caches in coast to the Tajik cause. Hamid was also able to borrow the Al-Farouk training camp, which al-Qaeda anyway had planned to shut down, for training Tajik recruits. Over time, al-Qaeda also contributed to the project with trainers. This appears to have been at the personal initiative of al-Qaeda's representatives in coast, Abu Atta al-Sharqi, and not something that was planned from the beginning. The Tajikistan Project, which was carried out in 1992 and 1994, involved a number of famous Afghan Arabs. Mustafa Hamid was there. Abu Zubaydah was there. Abu Atta al-Sharqi was also al-Qaeda's representative. Jihad Wall was there. Abid al-Hadi al-Iraqi, who later joined al-Qaeda and became the most high-ranking al-Qaeda commander on the Taliban front lines, was there. Even Khattab, who had been fighting in Nangarhar, was not part of Hamid's project, but went to Tajikistan and opened his own front line there, just as he'd done previously at the Jalalabad front. All these individuals were motivated for participation in classical jihad, as it had been promoted by Abdul Azam, with the aim to fight the occupation of Muslim lands, or alternatively, support Muslim insurgents or separatists, such as those in Chechnya and Tajikistan. The Tajikistan Project illustrates how al-Qaeda was only one among several actors in Afghanistan carrying these ambitions at the time. When Mustafa Hamid initially sought to gain support for the project, he encountered one of the major fault lines in the Afghan Arab community. Namely, how should the Arab Islamists continue their struggle against the Afghan-Soviet war was over? Many of the Afghan Arabs simply returned to their home countries to their normal lives. For some nationalities, like the Egyptians, it was difficult to return because they faced legal prosecution in their home countries. For those who stayed, some continued to be engaged in nonviolent activism, such as preaching or charity work. Then there were those who inclined to continue with some kind of militant activity. They could roughly be divided into two groups: those who wanted to take up arms against the Arab regime in their home country, and those who wished to take part in the classical jihad, wars to fight occupation on Muslim lands. The Afghan-Soviet War had been the prototype of the classical jihad, but it had also attracted men like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who at the time viewed Afghanistan as preparation for the revolutionary struggle in Egypt. This is why groups like Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gamma Islamiyah ran training camps in Afghanistan, but did not send fighters to the Mujahideen front lines. The coming Egyptian struggle was the only struggle that mattered to them. It was to be expected, therefore, that Mustafa Hamid's project was met by resistance from other Afghan Arab groups in Peshawar. He recalls a meeting he had with an Arab faction called the Caliphate Group in the headquarters in Peshawar. Hamid would quote, "I sat down with the deputy leader, 10 of his assistants, and a number of ordinary members. I soon realized I was subject to some kind of public inquisition. The deputy asked me, 'Why do you want to impede the jihad against the Arab Tajiks and the tyrants and open a project to mislead the youth?' I said that there were those who did not want or could not return to their home countries, and it was better for them to join a useful project instead of perishing on the streets of Pakistan or in a battle against a madman in Kabul." End quote. Hamid tells that in principle, his arguments were supported, but none of the Arab groups wanted to allocate resources to the project because they believed in prioritizing revolutionary struggles in their home countries. It did not make sense for members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad to send their men to Tajikistan, who they were fighting to establish an Islamic state in Egypt. Hamid noted, however, that Egyptians, including Egyptian Islamic Jihad members, participated in Tajikistan on individual initiative. The reason that Hamid had asked the Egyptians for support was that he needed qualified trainers to run training courses for the Tajiks. In the end, he managed to reach an agreement with some of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf's Afghan trainers, but they only stayed for one course, a rather disastrous affair, as the first batch of Tajiks were poorly motivated and lacked proper qualifications. According to Hamid, the dropout rate in the first course was close to 90%. Although 150 recruits arrived, only 15 completed the course. Abu Zubaydah's and Abu Atta's estimates for the time are somewhat better, with 250 recruits arriving and around 50 completing the course. Still, the dropout rate was a staggering 80%. Things improved over time. After Sayyaf's trainers had left, al-Qaeda got involved in training the Tajiks. This appears to have been the private initiative of Abu Atta al-Sharqi, who was an old friend of Mustafa Hamid. Abu Atta wrote to the al-Qaeda leadership in Sudan and informed them about the situation. But since the communication was so slow, he had already started supporting Hamid by the time he got the approval. After al-Qaeda joined the project, the training of the Tajiks became more organized. The Arabs found that the Tajiks had almost no knowledge of their own religion, so they hired some religious teachers from Haqqani's base to teach the fundamentals of Islam. Hamid made a point of hiring Afghans to do the religious classes for the Tajiks, because the Afghans were from Hanafi Islam, which was similar to the form of Islam practiced in Tajikistan. It was important not to teach the Tajik recruits Salafism or any other foreign Islamic practices, because they would risk being alienated from their home communities. This kind of religious pragmatism was shared by Abdul Azam, Osama bin Laden, and others. It was despised by certain other Arab groups in Afghanistan, the so-called Wahhabis, comprised of conservative Gulf Arabs who wanted to eradicate certain Afghan customs, such as worshipping graves and saints, on the grounds that they were un-Islamic. After the Taliban came to power, bin Laden similarly defended Mullah Omar from attacks from Wahhabi circles in his own country. The official training program ended in June of 1994. By this time around, 80 Tajiks had completed training in Al-Faruq and were ready to go back to Tajikistan. Mustafa Hamid and a delegation of Arabs traveled with the Tajiks to al-Nahda's headquarters in northern Afghanistan. The Arabs planned to enter the Tajik civil war alongside the Tajik trainees, but in the end, Hamid abandoned the plan due to safety issues, as he wrote. Meanwhile, individual Arabs fought in the Tajik civil war. The most organized group was probably led by Ibn Khattab. He established a rear base on Tajik territory just across the river Oxus, which marks the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. From here, Ibn Khattab's fighters carried out skirmishes and mortar attacks on Tajik government forces. Militarily speaking, their contribution was not very effective, and when the Tajik opposition fell into discord, Ibn Khattab left and made a name for himself in Chechnya. The formal cooperation between the Arabs and the Nahda ended in mid-1994. when Nada entered into peace negotiations with the Tajik government. But Hamid and Abu Atta al-Sharqi continued to train individual Tajiks in Jihad Wall training camp. In the autumn of 1994, they got a formal request from the Uzbek commander, Tahir Yuldashev, to train a group of Uzbeks as well as the so-called Tajikistan Project continued in an informal manner. Yuldashev and his group, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, would later play an important role fighting on the Taliban front lines in Afghanistan alongside al-Qaeda and other foreign militants. The other component of the Tajikistan Project, apart from the training, was to transport weapons from coast to Taloqan in northern Afghanistan to aid the Tajik rebels. It was not a straightforward task. If transported by land, the weapons would have to cross several front lines of the Civil War and would almost certainly be looted by some rogue commanders. So the plan initially was to transport the weapons by air. In the winter of 92-93, Mustafa Hamid's group organized for the coast airstrip to be repaired. In April 1993, the first plane load of weapons was flown to Taloqan, and another plane was sent about a month later. Then there were no more planes available. But there was still plenty of weapons left. So the Arabs decided, in the end, to send a truckload of weapons by land. They obtained permission from various parties to cross through their territories, but would nevertheless stop twice. Once by the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar commander south of Kabul, and once by a commander aligned with the Uzbek warlord Abdul Rashid Datsam. As far as we know, it was not Hekmatyar's policy to interfere with the al-Qaeda or the Tajikistan Project, but some of Hekmatyar's commanders feared the weapons would fall into the hand of their archenemy, Ahmad Shah Massoud. The suspicion was not unfounded, because Massoud was a close ally of the Tajik Nada party at the time, so they confiscated the truck. But the issue was solved fairly quickly through negotiations. Mustafa Hamid was able to use some of Hekmatyar's Arab commanders as intermediaries to negotiate the release of the truck. It illustrates a common phenomenon among the Afghan Arabs. Even if Arabs were from different ideological camps, they nevertheless were able to cooperate on practical issues. Datsam's commander, the second person to confiscate the truck, was a harder nut to crack. Abu Zubaydah wrote about the event in his diary, which confirms it was a prolonged affair. The truck was held by Datsam's commander for 7 months, from around September of 93 to April 1994. Mustafa Hamid had no choice but to reach out to one of the most powerful and respected commanders in Afghanistan, Sheikh Jalaluddin Haqqani, to solve the crisis. But in this case, even Haqqani was at a loss. "It is the most impossible thing in Afghanistan at the moment," he told Mustafa Hamid's messenger. The problem was only solved due to the ever-shifting alliances of Afghan rebel leaders. After Datsam's commanders confiscated the truck, Datsam joined in an alliance with Hekmatyar, and Hekmatyar in the end decided to help the Arabs get the truck back. The end of the story is that a substantial amount of weapons reached the Tajiks in the end, somewhere in the realms of 10 tons, if we take Mustafa Hamid's account literally. The story of the Tajikistan Project illustrates some common difficulties that foreign rebel groups encounter when operating in civil war settings. It supports the notion that failed states rarely constitute good safe havens for terrorists. The unpredictable and violent environment of civil war makes them vulnerable and prone to be exploited, either by local bandits or by various fighting factions who may have formerly posed as protectors. But even in a war-torn Afghanistan, there were islands of relative peace and stability. Khost and Nangarhar were two such areas. Khost was controlled by Jalaluddin Haqqani's clan, while Nangarhar was under the control of the Nangarhar Shura, led by the local warlord, Haji Abdul Qadir. Al-Qaeda's Jihad Wall camp in Khost survived, through the war, because they came under protection of the Khost government. Their initial protector in the province had been Fayez Muhammad from Hekmatyar's party. But in 1993-94, the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Fayez Muhammad soured considerably. Fayez Muhammad was furious that al-Qaeda had donated weapons to the Nahda party, which was allied with his archenemy, Ahmad Shah Massoud. He was constantly nagging the Arabs about buying their leftover ammunition and other equipment in order to use it in the civil war, but the Arabs refused. In the end, Fayez Muhammad's men physically assaulted Jihad Wall, and the coast government had to intervene. The incident was so grave that the al-Qaeda leadership in Sudan in the autumn of 1994 ordered Abu Atta al-Sharqi to evacuate Jihad Wall immediately. The conflict was solved when the coast government, which was dominated by Jalaluddin Haqqani's Zadran tribe, ensured al-Qaeda continued protection in the province. Abu Atta stayed because Mustafa Hamid requested his help with training a new batch of Uzbek recruits who were due to arrive soon. Abu Atta explained the situation in a letter to the al-Qaeda leadership in Sudan dated September 4, 1994. Al-Qaeda's answer is not available, but the request was apparently approved. In the autumn of 1994, the Al-Farouk camp was filled with Uzbek and Chechen recruits, and the spirits of both trainers and trainees were very high. The Uzbek and the Chechens were capable and highly motivated, unlike the first batch of Tajiks, who had arrived in the spring of 1993, where some 80 to 90% deserted. The security issues of Jihad Wall were also solved for the time being. Meanwhile, the Pakistani authorities were tightening the noose of the Arabs in Peshawar.